Welcome, everyone, to the Teaching Edge podcast, and I'm thrilled to have with me today George Couros. George Couros is a prominent educator, author, and speaker known for his work in innovative teaching, learning, and leadership. With over 20 years of experience in education, he's held various roles, including teacher, technology facilitator, school administrator, and is currently an adjunct instructor at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education. George is the author of several influential books, including The Innovator's Mindset and Because of a Teacher. He is a sought-after keynote speaker with presentations focused on fostering creativity and innovation in educational settings, emphasizing the importance of connecting with people's hearts to drive meaningful change. He also hosts the popular podcast, The Innovator's Mindset, where he discusses educational topics. George, it's wonderful to have you. Welcome to the show.
My pleasure. I always feel a little uncomfortable with those introductions because, it's a lot to live up to. But yeah, I think of all things too, that's not mentioned, I'm trying to be a continuous learner, always trying to figure out new stuff and trying to lead by example, but also, a father, and that's probably my most important role. So I think that is really kind of what drives a lot of what I do.
Yes, and I actually read some of your latest newsletters, and you mentioned this a lot about, separating from your job and your life and knowing what's important. I think that's tremendously important.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I would like to start with the concept of influence and actually read one of your own quotes,
Sure.
which is from Because of a Teacher. A teacher's influence doesn't stay in school, it goes out into the world and cannot truly ever be measured. Every student you inspire to do something great goes on to inspire others. There is no limit to your impact. So really, I want to start off with what is your message to teachers and educators about their important role?
I think when I looked at Because of a Teacher in the first place, it was that book came out probably, I think it was 2022, and probably COVID's still fresh in the mind of people all over the world. There was this 2-week period where everybody loved teachers. Like, it was only 2 weeks though. It was, teachers are the most important role ever. How can people do this? I can't even take care of my own kid. And then it kind of went back to really, being hard on education, and teachers do a ton with very little access to things. So then I wanted to kind of just start that podcast asking questions like, who's a teacher that inspired you? Who's an administrator that inspired you? And what was really fascinating, I actually started, and as I mentioned earlier, I try to really learn by example. I talked about my own kindergarten teacher who, I think about every single day when I tie my shoes, because she taught me that very first day how to tie in bunny ears. And I think all the way to my high school football coach, who was my phys ed teacher, who was in his very first year of teaching, who said to me that basically you can be ready to lead all you want, but the most important thing is, are you someone worth following? And I often share that story, that in that moment, I didn't really care that he said that. It had no impact on me at all. But when I thought about his words, were when I first became an assistant principal. And I think a lot of times, some of the most important lessons that teachers, teach our students, connect with them, they often don't really think about it until they're in their adult, lives, and that impact that they have. And so there's also the other side of it too. I've had situations where I think about, proving some of my teachers wrong. And, I always want to be on the positive side of that, really kind of, showing, the impact of students. And, there's so many stories that we could share. And I think that's how Because of a Teacher came back. When I shared those stories of my own teachers, I shared about 3 specific ones, never shared it with them, never told them. And within 24 hours, each one of them actually reached out to me, that someone they knew had heard my podcast and actually said, I think this is you that he's talking about right now. And it shows you, and that's why the book Because of a Teacher actually came together, is that so many teachers have these stories, and we often hear, the terrible things, the things that we're not doing well, or the things that people are mad about. But when things go well, as human nature, we don't typically share that for whatever reason that is. So I just made it an impact. And so I'm really proud of that book, because it's not just my stories, it's stories from other teachers, who are in the profession, other people that, do this job, talking about the impact their teachers had. And so I think it just really lasts a significant amount of time. but we often hear, like I said, we often hear the bad stuff. It's, a lot of people, they go on, for example, Twitter, Instagram to complain about stuff, but they really talk about all the good things happening. It's, and I'm trying to like shock that human nature into like, hey, let's be grateful for all the good stuff that's in our life.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I really personally relate to this. I had a teacher when I was 13. I was
Yeah.
living in New York, and 30, I think 33 years later, I visited this town where I lived. I went to the school. I asked them to locate. I asked them to locate him for me. They actually were able to. He gave me a call. He was in his 70s, I think, back then, and he didn't remember me. But I told him everything that I remembered. He had this wonderful note he left me in my yearbook about knowing I will succeed, and these words that I remember them by heart to this day. And I asked him how he was, and his reply was that it was a pretty tough day, but it just got a lot better. And it's it was amazing to receive that phone call. I didn't think I would hear from him, but yeah, I can really relate to that. I think these things can go years and years in the future and remain in our memories.
Yeah, and you even look at like a lot of books, a lot of keynotes, talks. They're like, Bill Gates didn't even graduate, or this person had this bad teacher.
Yeah.
But so it's like these one-off stories about a bad educational experience for someone successful, but there's way more stories of people having success because of their school experience, and
Yes.
we focus on the anomalies, not the norm. So I think that to me is really, really important.
Yeah, and I'm sure people listening to us, each one of them has this person or personality in their head that they are thinking of right now. Now, how does this relate? I want to relate this to your concepts about having an innovator mindset. So,
Right.
how do these relate? Why are these so important? These concepts, if you can explain a bit about them for those who haven't heard about them yet.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, like, probably the work I'm most known for is the innovator's mindset. And a lot of times when people hear the term innovation in education, they're solely focused on technology. And it's like, if you use technology, you're innovative. Now, I don't know in the UK, I know that's where you're located, but I'm sure that you know what a Scantron is, or it might have some different name of it. And I always use that as an example of how not all technology actually leads to better, right? Because when we talk about Scantrons, I remember as a high school teacher very early in my career, as soon as we got a Scantron, I made all my tests multiple choice. And it had nothing to do with how do we deepen learning for our kids? How do we actually make the school experience better? It's like, how do I make my life easier? So, and honestly, it actually probably made school worse for kids, because it was like, yeah, I can just check a box. I don't have to think about this because I'm kind of guessing.
Yeah.
So when you look at, because of a teacher, my focus on innovation, and it is really kind of seeing innovation as a human endeavor. So when we look at how important relationships are, how we have built a culture of trust, because we're asking people to try things that are different. We're asking people to take risks in their learning, try different things, and we're often asking that in a space where people don't feel that if they mess up, their administrators have their back, their leadership team has their back, that if you screw up, we want you to be innovative, but don't screw up. And it doesn't seem to make sense. So innovation is simply about doing new and better things. That's it. It's not about technology. It can be with technology, it can be without technology. It's not only just about teaching and learning, it's also about how we lead, rethinking the structure of, how we put professional learning days together. What's the learning experience for our staff? So when you talk about that connection between, really how people feel, how they're supported, no one becomes innovative in things that they hate. No one becomes innovative in a culture where they feel that if they mess up, that's it for them. And so it really is about building that community, that culture where it supports people trying new things in pursuit of creating the best opportunities we can for our students.
So I think it's also fostering courage in other people. So
Absolutely.
When you teach administrators or teachers, then you really want them to innovate so that they are not afraid to try new things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that too, like a lot of things that, and I've been blessed to speak over the world, and some of the structures and the things that we're doing, for example, in North America are very different, for example, in Australia, and how we're doing things. And then you try to actually bring some of those really great things you see in other countries and other places, and then the administrators are nervous about it because, you know, they don't want to go away from what they've always done. But they're also saying you need to try new things. But it's really easy to say that to somebody else, especially when you have the authority to get rid of them, to fire them.
Yeah.
So part of it too is, as administrators, and I challenge people with this all the time, if there's something that I'm saying that you're uncomfortable with, but you want to try, make that very apparent to your staff that you are also having the courage, as you share, to try new things, to do something different in pursuit of making the experience for the adults the best thing possible. Because a lot of times we just kind of show the end result of our of the new things that we're trying. We don't actually show the process where we kind of struggle with it too. And that's why I really make, you know, my learning visible, to say like, hey, here's something I'm really having a hard time with. Here's something I'm struggling with. And so you can kind of see the process, not just the end result.
So how do you get people more comfortable about the possibility that they may fail if they innovate? They may it may not work for them. They may get the administrator angry at them, and so on.
Yeah, I think the term failure is something that I kind of struggle with, in the sense that we almost talk about the notion of promoting failure and how important that is. And then, you talk about, like, again, Bill Gates, Oprah, like, they failed so many times. Well, it's really easy to point to billionaires.
Yeah.
Right? Like, oh, look at this. No, they've actually done pretty well. Like, and as part of that too. And so people, when we think of failure, especially from a public perspective outside education, we often think about the students who never graduated, who never maybe, led the lives that they had the potential to live. So it's not necessarily a really important, like a crucial aspect. So when I look at failure, it's really kind of thinking about, is it really the failure that we're promoting, or is it the resiliency, the getting back up when things don't go right? And so when we're trying to create a culture of learning, that we're always trying, to get better in our practice, it's like, what did you learn from this process? And I don't think anybody's trying something that they don't truly believe would actually not benefit students and, benefit, some of the experience that they're actually having in their classrooms. But if something doesn't work for our students, and I talked about this in Innovator's Mindset. If you had a student who you basically was struggling to read, and you learned all of these different, processes in university, in your post-secondary education, maybe in some workshops, but none of those things seem to work with that particular student, do you just say, well, that's it, I guess we know? Or do you say, okay, I know, like, I learned this, but it's not working. So what if I tweak this? What if I change this? So it's not really focusing on the failure part of it. It's actually trying to figure out the resiliency, kind of going through that process. And that really is about learning. And there's a really great image from Dimitri Martin. He's actually a comedian, and it was meant as a joke. And it talks about what success actually looks like. And there's like this line of up and down, right? Like, it's still going in an upward trajectory, but there's ups and downs. And all I do is simply take the word success, and I replace it with learning. And if you think about it, that's what learning is. It is a messy process, but we try so hard in education to make learning a linear process, that it's just a straight line going up. There's no bumps along the way. But really, some of those failures is the best opportunity to maybe, try something new, maybe even sometimes totally alter a path. But if we don't embrace that, we're not really embracing learning. We're just talking about getting kids to do a check mark to, on that straight line to success, which doesn't actually exist.
Yeah. Wow, that's great. Actually, love Dimitri Martin's graphs. I think teachers could show them to students. Absolutely. And they would love it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
He's very innovative there.
Yes. Very, very interesting, very different delivery in comedy, right? So
yeah, completely. Yeah. And combination of intelligence and humor. Yeah.
I think it's funny too, like, I probably threw you off a little bit that I'm referencing a comedian in education. And I think that's part of it too, is that this is everyday life. We don't have to just reference, academics or people that are focused on education. This is life. Is, seeing people do different things, trying different stuff, not just taking the exact same approach that other people took. Because when someone says to me like, hey, this worked for 90% of students, my first response is, what are you doing for the other 10%? Are you just saying too bad? Or are you trying to figure something out? And I think that's, we have to look outside of education for, some ideas for inspiration. But the hope is that we're continuously becoming better at learning, that, outside of education looks at us to see how do we actually embrace learning, embrace the ups and downs? Or are we just teaching kids to do checklists, to do just the check mark to go into the next phase of their life?
Right. What about your own inspiration? What got you into this whole field as an educator?
Yeah, like I probably, to be honest with you, I joke, and it's I joke, but I'm kind of serious. I actually didn't want to go into education. I really enjoyed I really enjoyed the movie Billy Madison. I don't know if your audience knows that movie. I just thought, like I loved seeing Adam Sandler around kindergarten kids. I'm like, that looks awesome. So I didn't really know what to do. And I kind of wanted to go in education just because I liked being around, I'm kind of a kid at heart. I still feel that. And I just like being around students. But then I also really started looking at my own parents. They were immigrants to Canada from Greece. And really kind of as I progressed, seeing how even though they had very little formal education, they were absolutely incredible learners. They really adapted to change in a way that I honestly don't know if I could have done it. So I try to take inspiration for them. Honestly, also thinking, I don't think I could have like moved to a country and not know the language and, figured out so much with, so little formal education. So I think it's really kind of seeing that intersection of how do we, adapt to our change. And so my parents really saw, even though they had very little education themselves, they saw education as a way to a better life than, maybe what they kind of saw for themselves at that time. So I think that's really kind of really just being around young people really inspired me, but also seeing, the importance of education always being relevant. And that's why I talk about innovation, because education has to continuously proceed to ensure that we are relevant to making lives better. And I know this might sound sacrilegious on an education podcast. I actually really challenge educators to think like, is college the only way? Are we always trying to do everything we can for our students to say, this is all about going to more education, to and more formal education? Or are we actually saying like, there's so many different opportunities for our students that didn't exist when we were kids? Are we teaching them about that? Or are we just saying, trying to get them there? And like, I'll give you a little example of how we kind of do subtle things. And this might be a little controversial. It really bothers me when I hear educators referring to students as scholars. And it's like, our scholars. And I don't know, again, I know we are in different continents. I don't know if that's something that you typically hear, but when you're saying scholars, we often don't think of plumbers or welders as scholars, right? So it's kind of like saying it's all about being academic. It's all about continued education. Whereas I say this all the time. When a plumber comes to my house, they are by default the smartest person in my house. I have no idea what they're doing, but they're absolutely incredible. They know what they're doing. They have an intelligence I don't actually have. And do we sometimes devalue those things by some of the language that we share and some of the things that we say, like there's only one pathway that school leads to, and if you don't actually hit that college, somehow you've become a failure. I think that's where I really want to try to challenge that we have to really help our kids not all be good at the same thing, but in their process of school, figure out how they're good at something and what is that something and how do they discover that in education.
Yeah, I'll tell you, in fact, that my experience studying in the States as a boy, just for 2 years, actually, my experience was that maybe it was in that particular school, but that there was really a search for what I was good at and improve that, rather than take care of all my weaknesses. And that was a revelation for me back then. So it was a really good school. But
absolutely. And there's so many educators who are doing that. But then again, this is why I really challenge leadership. They're really trying to focus on the, standardized test scores, and doing this. And it's like, hey, don't teach the test, but also the only thing we're going to talk about is the results on these tests. And so it's like, well, you typically drive the way you're teaching by the way that you're assessed. So that, if all you're talking about is the test scores, so you're seeing more and more people push this. Now, here's the reality. Now, this is something I address in schools all the time. I can't come into a school that is being measured by test scores, academics, and say, don't worry about it, because then it's a really simple thing for me to say, doesn't help them in any way. So Katie Novak and I wrote the book called Innovate Inside the Box, understanding here are some of the constraints that we actually have in education, and we want to continuously push those constraints to really rethink how education will look. But that's something that we can't do immediately, and we don't necessarily have the power to. But you can still really think about innovative practices, and really, as you shared, really developing the strengths of our students while understanding there are constraints in what we're doing in education, but still bringing the best out of our kids. Because it's such an easy thing to just say, you know what, all we care about is the scores, so we teach that. And I really hope that, because I know the majority of educators want to bring out the best in their kids, but then their leadership is kind of focused on, it's all about scores. It's all about making sure you're good at school, not necessarily good at learning, which are not necessarily always the same thing.
Yeah, yeah. I believe some students may be very good at learning and still get low scores because
Absolutely.
you don't always do well on a test, even though you might be a great learner.
Well,
Can you?
if you looked at my grades in school, you probably would never invited me on your podcast. So just give me that heads up.
Yeah. Probably. Can you share some real life stories from teachers who or principals that you've seen, implement this, embracing this innovator's mindset?
Yeah, like one of the examples I share, and kind of going back to that notion of it innovates to the box. I share this. I talked about this years ago. Just kind of questions you should ask your students at the beginning of the year, and it was like things like, what does success look like to you? What are something you're passionate about? And like, I have other questions. I encourage people to use them, to modify them, to scrap them, to add to them, whatever. But I really try to get people to understand, if you kind of do this throughout the year, or even at the beginning of the year, and you don't use it as an icebreaker activity, but a research activity, like understanding. So I'm right now, I'm wearing an Orlando Magic hoodie. I'm a huge basketball fan, and you would know within 2 seconds that I love basketball in those questions. So at the early levels, we know this. Students will read at higher levels if they're interested in what they're reading about. So it's not just, it's not giving them, War and Peace their first week of school, but it's actually, what are they interested in? So the example that I often use is, let's say you have a student who wants to become a YouTuber, but you're teaching science, right? And so you're like, well, what is, that's all nice, but I can teach science, and here's the curriculum, here's the things, the standards. So could you not actually say to that student, this is, an example I often share in my talks. Could you not say to that student, hey, I know you want to become a YouTuber. Here's this thing that I have to teach in science. Could you not actually do a video and explain the concept to me, and actually explain the concept? So it's not curriculum or the innovation, it's actually how you tie the two together. And so actually the ability to teach, I'm actually reading Adam Grant's book right now, Hidden Potential, and he talks about something that I've talked about often, is that the ability to teach something actually makes you know it even deeper. And there's a quote from Joseph Joubert. He says, to teach is to learn twice. So what is your depth of understanding a concept when you teach it to the entire world? So could you actually leverage that child's interest and actually want to be, creating videos and doing that to actually have a deeper understanding, so they teach the concept? Because once they get to the test, they'll be fine. They'll have no issue with it because they just taught it to the entire world. They have to know it inside out. So, kind of going back to, your own personal experience, here's a strength, here's a passion of a student, here's the thing I got to teach. How can I actually connect the two? And I don't think you can do that every single day. I would be lying to you if I said that. But the more opportunities for that, the easier it is to do the stuff that kind of sucks, that you're not really excited about. But if it's only doing the stuff you hate, then eventually you're going to tune out, right? You got to see that some of that value into, like, how really people are tapping into what you utilize. And so, that to me is just kind of one example of something you can do to kind of connect the two. It's not an either or, because I also want students to do well academically. I want them to do well in their tests. I don't want to visit any school and then their test scores go down after because they listen to me. I want them also to go up, but also students have more satisfaction, staff have more satisfaction, but also ensure that, they still are measured by those things after I leave. So how do you ensure that, both of those things are accelerating, not one or the other?
Yeah, I think a common thread in everything that you're saying is really taking the material, not putting it aside, but connecting it to the person, really connecting it to the teacher, connecting it to the students. Yeah, this YouTube example, I think it reminds me. You might know this YouTuber Vsauce.
Oh, yeah.
You do. So it's amazing what you can do with science and connect it to YouTube if you just do a little research about these things. I found out about him from my son, actually. So
And it's interesting, like that is, it's funny because there are actually, and I say this, there are scientists on YouTube who have science channels, but I have no idea of their degrees. I just see their stuff. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And people measure by the quality of what they're producing, not necessarily what their degrees are behind them. So I think that is a really important aspect, is that we often say degrees are a measure of, success or relevance or your understanding of something, but, people are kind of looking and saying, like, this person either knows what they're doing or they're not. And it is kind of connecting those things that we can kind of tap into some of those passions and strengths, from the work that we're actually doing.
Yeah. You mentioned a few books. You mentioned Adam Grant. You mentioned Katie Novak. If you had to recommend 3 books you could gift any teacher, what would these be?
Yeah, one of my favorite books I've read recently is Will Guidara's Unreasonable Hospitality, and I know it sounds like a non, and it isn't an education book. And maybe I have a certain bias towards it because it's about a gentleman who basically wanted to actually make their restaurant one of the best in the entire world. That was his goal. And he talks about really kind of knowing the people that come into his restaurant every single day to create that. Yeah. And I'm biased because, I grew up in a restaurant. My parents, owned a restaurant in our little small town in Canada. And so I saw a lot of the similarities of what I picked up from my mom and dad and how I actually led my school to Will Guidara's book, really thinking about that impact. Another book that I love, and I am biased towards this because it is one we published, it's Megan Lawson's Legacy of Learning. She really shows the impact that educators can have and really kind of gives really subtle ways to really think about how you're bringing out the best in the people that you serve, because we're often asking, like, hey, teachers, we need you to bring out the best in your kids, but then also putting teachers in really, like, your focus on strengths as a student is something that resonates with you still. Do we do the same thing with our staff? I talked about in Innovator's Mindset, Ontario Education, Ontario, Canada. There's an article, I'll never forget, and I know PISA scores are a little bit more well-known probably in UK versus, the US. I don't really ever hear about PISA scores. We hear about them in Canada quite a bit. Okay. And one of the things that said in this article, I'll never forget it, said Ontario education, literacy scores go up while math scores go down. So that was there was something like that in the title. In the article, literacy was mentioned 0 times. It was always like, teachers suck at math, teachers suck at math, teachers suck at math. What did every school district in Ontario do? Start putting an emphasis on math. Doing this. So the district superintendents, the directors of learning focus on this. Then the principals get on it. They're like, you suck at math, you suck at math, you suck at math. And then, we have teacher retention issues. We have teachers totally disengaged from their profession. And the first thing that we should have said out of that article was like, why are we so good at literacy? Like, what are we doing there? That's really, really good. And actually, let's talk about that. Let's focus on that. Now, what are some of those things that we can do in literacy that we're doing really well? How do they would actually apply to how we're teaching math? And actually focusing on that. And it's not ignoring weaknesses. It's actually starting with strengths. And Megan does a really good job with that. Another book that I love. So I've given you 2. The third one I love, and I know it sounds weird. It's Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. I truly love that book. It's one of my favorites. And I think not only do I really love the messaging, and I think it's a really great book, especially how teachers connect with people, how administrators connect with their staff. But the thing I love about that book is I probably read it 6-7 years ago, and I just thought it was one of the most interesting books I've ever read. And I was like, when was this actually written? And I think it was in the 1930s. And to think about how some of the most important things that we teach are timeless. And that's something that when we talk with our own books, and I know you had Dave Burgess on, one of the things we talk about with our authors is will your message be relevant 30 years from now? Like, don't try to jump on fads. Focus on what is timeless. Focus on how we actually really, there's things that are really, really important, and they'll be important today. They'll be important a year from now because, in education, we are so bad with trend chasing that we try to focus on the next thing. And so, like, even a guy who focused on innovation, I really hammer the importance of kids knowing their basics, that they have the ability to read and write. And when you have a deep understanding of those things, then you have the ability to innovate. But if you can't read and write, you're not innovating. If you don't know simple numeracy, you're not going to be able to do that. And I think there's a disconnect, and probably some of my own fault, because I've really tried to focus on that. I talked a lot about innovation, assuming that of course, we're teaching kids reading and writing, but really now I'm really trying to emphasize, this is truly important too, to get to this point, but it also shouldn't be the end point. We don't want kids just to walk out of school with the ability to read and write. That is the bare minimum. How are we trying to get them to go beyond? And I think that's why that book really influenced me. It's not just the messaging, it's the timelessness of it.
Yeah, I agree, and I think one of his notions, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, it's all about, for example, to be interesting, be interested, things of that nature. And I think to a principal or a teacher who interacts with other people all day long, this is again, it's timeless. I definitely agree. Now, did you encounter any resistance towards your approach? I heard I heard one of I heard one of your stories in one of your clips that I watched about you as a principal taking down the photos of the older principals at the school, and what that brought about. You encourage teachers and administrators to be innovative. What kind of resistance do you face?
Yeah, I think you always face resistance when you're trying anything new, especially when you're focused on innovation. And that I think for me, and this kind of goes back to Dale Carnegie's book. When I really kind of started in the profession, it's funny because I actually have been blogging, I think, and I still blog. I'm like kind of old school. Not many people blog anymore, right? But I think it's actually, it's funny because we have this emphasis on literacy, but all these people, all they do is like videos and things like that. But to actually deeply write, like, we don't necessarily model that. I don't know. And that's why it's really important to me is that I've really expanded my knowledge through not just reading more, but writing more. And one of the articles I wrote years ago, it was basically, I can't remember the title of it, but it was basically saying, like, if we don't move forward, you are going to become so irrelevant. Like, if you don't embrace some of these new ideas, some of these new opportunities, that basically education will no longer need you. You're basically outsourcing yourself to someone who will take your job and do much better. And so I remember the moment I wrote this. I remember where I was at a conference. I was listening to some speaker, and it's like, these people are so backwards. They're never gonna like try anything new. And I mad blogged. I know it sounds weird, but I was like upset about it. And it's funny because I actually look at that blog and I agree with much of my sentiment there, but not my approach. And this is one of the things I love about blogging is you can actually see, kind of going back to the Dimitri Martin thing, it's like some of the dips and saying like, hey, that's actually like, this is not a good way to approach this. So, but what it did was all the people who agreed with me were like, yeah, you tell them, right? And they're all with me. All the people who didn't agree with me, I probably pushed them further away, right? I didn't, and even if I didn't, do you really want to shame someone to trying something new, right? Like, that's not a good approach. So for me, I think it's more about when you're trying to get people to move forward and to try different things, it's less about trying to convince them as opposed to listening and seeing where they're at and trying to find some common ground and helping them build confidence and competence through that process. And I think, when we're talking about some of the things that we're doing in our schools, like I wrote a blog post years ago. It's called The Impact of Awards. And we actually as a principal, we got rid of awards in our school. And the mentality behind getting rid of awards was often like, oh, we feel bad for our kids who don't win them they're really upset about it. And it kind of feels like this, everyone gets a trophy culture, which I'm totally not for. Like, I'm not that guy.
Yeah.
So as I started reading, I remember reading Dan Pick's Drive. It actually was really interesting because it actually demotivated the students who were winning them as well, because they weren't really focused on deep learning. They were focusing on what's the check mark I need to get the award. So they were just learning to basically check boxes. So it wasn't just actually impacting the students who weren't getting them, it was actually impacting the students who were as well. So as I'm like kind of going through this process as the school leader and as the school administrator, I'm not taking a side on this. I'm just kind of sharing my learning through the process. Like, oh, this is really interesting. And then we had conversations with our parent community. We had conversations with our teachers. And then when we actually did remove the award ceremony and focus not on every kid getting a ribbon, anything like that, but saying like, hey, we have to have authentic and timely appreciation for our students to, honor what they're doing in the moment, not save it for a special ceremony at the end of the year, but do it continuously. That's where we'll get the best out of our learning. When we actually moved that process, no one pushed back. And the reason they didn't push back is because we were learning together through this process. We were listening to some of the concerns. We were addressing some of the things that we're doing, but didn't just take a side. Too often education, it's like a surprise. Like, it's like, hey, we're trying this new thing. We've been researching it. We didn't actually tell you about it, but it's going to be very different from your experience as a student. But we'll promise you it works. And then you get parent pushback. But we brought our families alongside, and we didn't really take a stance on anything. We were just saying, we got to look into this because this is actually helpful. So I think, if you're trying to get people to try something new, don't just dismiss what they're doing already. Listen to what they're doing and find the good stuff that they're focusing on and try to kind of get them to see themselves as part of the solution, as opposed to simply just saying, look, we're going with or without you. Right.
Yeah.
Kind of, there's so many teachers who I probably pushed away early in my career because they didn't think exactly the way that I thought. Whereas I now know it's important that I think a certain way, other people think a certain way. How do we actually bring out the best in each other? And so really that's through listening, as opposed to trying to convince someone your way is the right way.
Yeah, I think that's very, very powerful. And in fact, you were able to really articulate why, the reasoning behind what you're doing. I think rather than saying, okay, I'm the educator, I know what to do. But I think you really were able to explain it. And, I think this example is really interesting because they continue to get awards, but the award was showing how great the kid did. And this idea that everyone gets a ribbon, I think in your case, yes, everyone could get a ribbon, but a real one, because every kid would be strong at something else, and that's their ribbon. So everyone wins.
And it's authentic, right? We want to honor the people that we serve, and it's something we talk about all the time. Like, we often think about schools are so focused on collaboration, but then you walk in, it's like top student of the week, top academic student. It's like, well, really, are we focused on collaboration, or are we focused on the best, the singular one person? So there's some disconnect there, and I think that, like I said, there is some of those conversations, and I'm not a pushover either. Right. And so to me, there's a difference between opinion and informed opinion. Right. So if you're going to push back, I'm going to need you to give me something there. Don't just say I'm wrong. Tell me why. Explain that. And maybe there's something I'm missing. Even today, I go in, I'm brought in to speak to school districts. And one of the things I say after I share some ideas, I'm like, hey, I want to know what your ideas are. I want to know what your questions are, but I also want to know what your challenges are. So what do you not agree with me? And it is imperative that you tell me while I'm in the room. Don't wait till I leave, because that doesn't actually help me. I'm trying to figure out some stuff my own, and I'm trying to get better at this too. But it doesn't, when you kind of just dismiss what I said, but then challenge me after I left, when I've given you the opportunity to challenge me in the room, it's not about my idea or your idea, it's about the best idea. We don't really care where it comes from. And I not only do that because I think it's really important for me to grow in my learning, but I'm trying to model to those administrators. It is imperative to tell people to challenge you, because you don't know everything. That's why you have staff, right? You're trying to bring in people who have different perspectives, who have different ideas, and maybe you're not doing the right thing. I always say this, I have an ego. I want to do really, really well. And what I learned through leadership, you do really, really well when other people do well. That's how you actually excel as a leader. It's not when you individually do well. It's when everyone else does well. That's how you do well as a leader.
Wow, that's excellent. Excellent. I'll quickly jump to a different topic. We had two major disruptions in the recent few years. One was COVID and one was AI. What's your views about the impact of these?
Well, I think COVID really was an interesting thing because everyone in the world was impacted by it somehow, right? And everyone was impacted by it in different ways. I personally, I don't know if you know this about my journey. I was really overweight, really struggled with, my own health. And a lot of it was because of travel, just eating unhealthy, bad routines, things like that. So I think I lost like 120 pounds over COVID. So really trying to get my health in journey. I think that to me is like, hey, this was like basically a world, an opportunity for us to kind of rethink what we're doing, what we're trying to achieve. And it wasn't just, a physical change with me. It was like really what matters in my world. Like, all this stuff in education, I'm really proud of. But at the end of the day, who's going to show up to my funeral? Right. And it's probably not a bunch of people on Twitter. Hopefully it's going to be my family. But if I don't actually smarten up, it might not be anybody. So I think to me, we have to really rethink about what kind of, what's the impact we're trying to make and really what's most important in our lives. So maybe taking a little step back from education. And it's interesting because the more I've kind of like separated my personal life from my education life, the better I've become, I feel, as an educator, because I have a better understanding. But when you're so obsessed with teaching, you're so obsessed with education, you're kind of like, it's kind of like when you're in a bad relationship and you don't really know you're in a bad relationship until you leave the relationship. You're like, oh, that was really bad. And so you kind of need to step away sometimes to see the totality of what you're doing in education. I think, it sometimes gives you a different perspective. When you're a principal, you start to see things a little bit differently because you get to see other teachers teach, right? But when you're teaching side by side, you don't necessarily notice some things. It's the same thing. It's like when you become a superintendent, you see kind of how principals lead buildings. Sometimes when you pull back and you get a different perspective. So it's trying to do that, every single day. The artificial intelligence thing I find is really, really fascinating because, there's artificial intelligence has been embedded in our lives all forever. And well, I shouldn't say forever, but for an extremely long amount of time, and we don't notice it. ChatGPT comes out, disrupts everything because it's just kind of in your face all of a sudden. The interesting thing, and I think and I'm looking at this quite extensively, is there's this focus on artificial intelligence everywhere. And then there's also this focus on stoicism and really kind of looking at, philosophers in ancient times. And it's like kind of these two parallels. It's like people going in totally different worlds. Like, I'm going to eat from the earth and, this and like everything's tech. And it's kind of like two different camps. So I'm like saying like, hey, how do we actually use this stuff to make us smarter, not to replace our thinking? And one of the things I've really been challenging is I remember seeing a speaker show you how you can get artificial intelligence to create ideas for your lesson plans and to like take away all the thinking as a teacher to do that. And when I was sitting there, I'm like, okay, that's, I can see how that could save you time. Would you show that process to a student? Would you show like, hey, here's how I'm actually doing way less work and getting this thing to do the thinking for me? Because a lot of teachers would be really mad if a kid did the same thing. Like, hey, you know what? I'm not even going to do this essay. I'll just get this computer to think for me. So I kind of look back at Dan Pink's Drive, talking about like what motivates us. And one of the things he talked about is he kind of goes back to, and this is kind of going back to awards. So awards are really bad for deep learning, right? It's really about, awards are good when you're doing things like mowing the lawn, right? It's just like a back and forth motion. It's not the most, but it's like a no thought process. So I think when I look at artificial intelligence, it's like, well, how am I getting it to do the mow the lawn task, but not replace my thinking? That's where I'm trying. How do I actually use this to make me a better thinker, to actually get me deeper into my work, as opposed to replace the thinking of what I do? Like I thought it was really interesting. I saw somebody share like, oh, we had AI write our entire curriculum. Like it did the entire thing for our district. And I'm like, great. Now why do you even have a job? Like you're actually like teaching, you're showing people why you shouldn't be relevant, like why you shouldn't do this. Is that really what we want to do? Now, can we use it to kind of inspire some ideas, to go deeper into it? That's where I kind of focus on. So it's really kind of, I don't want to be in like one camp or the other. It's like, hey, some of those timeless things that we focus on forever are really, really important. But also, like, how are we leveraging some of these things? But if we're just using it to, replace our thinking, it's not a good use. I don't know if and I'm probably dating myself here. We had an Apple IIc when I was a kid. And I remember it very distinctly and how hard it was to use. And I like in the sense that you actually had to know how to program to get that computer to do anything. And there's a little bit of me who thinks I was better with technology as an 8-year-old than I am as a 50-year-old, not because I was smarter then. It's because the technology was so hard to use, they had to have an understanding of how to do different things. Whereas when you get an iPhone, there's no instruction manual. You pull it out because they dumb it down for you so you don't understand it. And the more we actually just kind of, use this technology that's getting easier, the easier it is to actually replace our thinking. So I think it's really being cognizant. That's why I know it sounds weird. That's why I still blog. I could have ChatGPT write a blog post and say like, write a blog post on this and, make it viral and do this. And yeah, I could probably get more attention, but it's not making me any smarter. And then who am I to speak to people when it's just, kind of replacing me? So I think that's where we got to utilize this in thoughtful ways.
So the role of the principal or teacher in creating guidelines for students, do they need to have these guidelines? What to use, what not to use?
Yeah, I think it's actually, instead of saying don't use it, it's saying like, hey, here's how I use it. So I'll give you an example, and this is something I do in my own learning. So I do book reviews. Yeah. And weirdly enough, I've actually read more physical books in probably the last 2 years than I have my entire life. I don't know why. I've tried to like do Kindle very limited, but actually hold the physical copy of my book. Yeah. And as I'm like reading the book, I'll like, write some notes. So then I'll actually say, hey, I really enjoyed this book. Here's why. And I'll talk about some things. But I'm actually going to just read a little summary of the book so you kind of have understanding it is that I pulled from ChatGPT. Yeah. So I actually say it out loud, right? Now, here's 3 quotes. Here's why they resonate. Here's why they connect with me. So what I'm actually doing there is saying, here's the George stuff. Here's me outright referencing how I used artificial intelligence in this process. And then actually then doing something that ChatGPT could not do and couldn't actually give a perspective based on my own life experience that I'm actually able to provide. So the reason I do that is not just to, build my podcast, things like that, but to model to teachers, like I am explicitly telling you I've used this. And I think that's where we got to actually help our students like, hey, we don't want you not using it. We want you to think about how you use it and make sure you let everyone know when you have used it in that process. But pretending it doesn't exist is not a good practice either. There's actually a really, and I don't know if you've ever seen it. And I kind of go back to being childish. There's a really great South Park episode. And it actually, Mr. Garrison's the teacher and he's getting frustrated because he's having a really hard time grading the essays of the kids because the kids have found ChatGPT. He doesn't know this. And they're writing all the essays. So their writing is getting better. It's more complex. He's struggling with it. So he goes home and he complains to his partner about it. And his partner says, do you know there's this thing called ChatGPT? You should use it to grade the essays. So what's happening is the students are actually using ChatGPT to to write the essays. The teacher's going home, doing this. No one's actually doing any thinking, which I find is really like, that's what I want to stay away from. It's like pretending like if teachers are using it to better their lives, do they teach kids how to use it? And I don't know if you saw it, and I don't know if you share any links here. I talked about 4 questions to consider with artificial intelligence, ChatGPT. And ChatGPT, is like only one of the many, many things. As soon as artificial intelligence, things that aren't are even artificial intelligence to be called artificial intelligence because we're trying to sell, right? Everything's trying to make money off of it. And I said, okay, so the first thing you say, what's the negative of this? Let's get that out of the way. Let's talk about it. Okay, what's the good about this? Okay, now how can I use this in my everyday life? And one of the things I talk about is like doing marathon training. I actually had to make a plan for me, go over and customize it to me and, make it really, that's one thing. Okay, so now I can see the value of it in my life. Hey, I'm trying to eat better. Tell me a grocery list, etc. So now I see the value of it in my personal life. Then, hey, how could this actually make my job better? So then I talk about some of the things like, for example, scheduling as a principal. Years ago, we used to have these giant boards and we put all the schedules. It'd take, days and if not weeks to do this. You can get artificial intelligence to that. Make your life way easier. It's kind of that mow the lawn technique. And then we talk about how students could use this in their learning. The reason I actually save that question for the end is I'm trying to get people to see the value of it personally, see the value of it professionally, and then think about the students. Too often what we do, we see something new, we jump right to how could students use this? Well, I think it's stupid. I don't think we should use this. This is dumb, blah, blah, blah. Well, of course you think it's dumb because you don't see any relevance to your own life. But as soon as I see, hey, this actually could make my life better. So if you see it makes your life better, then you'll want to teach the students how to use it. But jumping right to the students, that's where we're losing people. It's like they don't see any value of it to their own life, right? And I think that approach, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's anything, that's how we should focus on things. How do we get people to see personal value, professional value, and then talk about the students, right? Talk about all the bad stuff too. Here's how this can hurt us. Let's get that out of the way. Here's the benefits of it. Let's talk about that. Then let's talk about personal, professional. Then let's talk about students.
Well, I think if I look again at this common thread, I think if I were a principal or teacher, listening to us, I think starting to use ChatGPT, looking at comics like comedians like Dimitri Martin, looking at YouTube and all of these amazing creators. I think, I think a teacher could then understand the lives of the students much better as well. See how they get tons of value suddenly from TikTok or YouTube, and then they would relate a lot more, definitely.
Absolutely.
What is the most uncommon piece of advice that you've given about teaching that more people should know about, in your opinion?
I don't know. I don't know if I give anything that's uncommon. I think really the focus on get to know the people you serve, understand what their strengths are. How do you actually leverage them? I don't know if that's uncommon advice. I remember when I first started teaching, and many people in education is like, hey, don't smile till after the Christmas holidays. Don't smile till after December. And I know the year, depending on where your audience is different. And it's really the importance of having a relationship. And it's not, I think a lot of times relationships get a bad rap in education because the mentality is like, oh, we're like best friends with the kids, we're all fluffy. It's not that. It's actually getting people to know you as a human being, to have an understanding, so that when you challenge them, they know you have your back. It's the same thing, I think administrators, for me, a lot of the practices that administrators preach to their teachers to do with their students, the administrators don't do with their teachers. I think that's where I try to kind of go that approach. But I also think, the focus on innovation that I've had is really progressed for me over the years, is not negating basic skills for our kids. That we're not trying to do all these amazing things outside of education, in our personal lives without actually having the basics. And I think to me, I looked at I don't know if you're going to kind of get to this. I know we're about over here for time.
Yep.
You talk about, you give me kind of either or. There is no either or in education. It's always nuance. It's always kind of a spectrum. And I think a lot of times it's we have the basics camp and the innovation camp. We have there's the reading wars going on. It's like an either or. And it's nah, actually a lot of times the answer is somewhere in the middle. And maybe, a lot of people get mad when you don't take a side. It's not, I'm not taking a side. It's actually, I'm trying to figure out what's best for kids. And I think that when we pull practices from different things, from different people, even when I became an administrator, the first person that I hired was my assistant principal. And my assistant principal was a teacher on my staff when I was assistant principal. And she challenged me so hard. She pushed me. We would get in arguments all the time. And when I became a principal, I'm like, that's who I want. I want someone who thinks differently than me.
Yeah.
I don't need a bunch of people. And I think in education, we can become, it's like, hey, we want, we just want a bunch of people who all think the same. It's like, no, actually, I want people who think differently than me because I already think like me. I don't need two of me. I already got me.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of it too. So oftentimes it's like kind of finding that, the differing perspectives, somewhere the answer is in the middle.
Wow, that's wonderful. First of all, really, George, thank you. And this has been really wonderful. I know you've got to run soon. I do want you to say more about where people can find your work, your books, your workshop. Where's the best place to find you?
Yeah, the best place you can go is my own website, georgecouros.com. And I want to share this because I think it's really important. The whole reason my website, blogging, podcasting, all of this stuff, even my books, all of that started because when I was a principal, we wanted students to have digital portfolios. And we were trying to teach them that, and it was just failing horribly. And the reason it failed is because we were trying to teach them something we had never done ourselves. So my website, the space where you can find me, totally 100% came about when I was a principal saying like, I'm going to go first. I don't know how to teach this. Why am I asking my teachers? We don't know what we're doing. So I actually went through the process, and then it's like, wow, this is really pushing my learning. Wow, this is like, I'm getting opportunities to speak. Why would anyone want me to speak? And so it opened up doors to me that I didn't even know existed. And so what we're trying to do intentionally is how do we ensure that our kids actually start to really focus on their own learning, but also how do we get them to open doors? So like I shared that because I don't want just the people to think like I one day wanted to become a speaker and an author and I just made a website. That's not how I did it at all. I actually wanted to help my students. And for me to do that, I had to go through what they're trying to understand some of these new opportunities. I can't really teach them unless I go through them first. So that's, that website I suggested is not a branding thing. It's a learning thing. And that's how it came about.
Wonderful, wonderful. So once again, it's George Couros, which is COUROS.com. And I really recommend everyone to go look it up, listen to your podcast, read your books, and really there's so much more than what we had time for. I really, really appreciate this. It's been wonderful. So once again, thank you very much, George.
Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your day too, right? I know you're a little bit later than me and you worked around my schedule, so I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.